Hey folks, just a quick little note here while the intro's rolling. You may notice, if you're clever and observant, a couple of edits during this episode. Yes, that does mean that there were some fights we wanted to discuss, that we did discuss, that couldn't really fit in this runtime. So make sure you head over to the Heavy Hands Patreon if you want to hear that stuff. Bye! Hello and welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is my intrepid co-host, Philip Mackenzie. Intrepid is my go-to adjective when I don't know what else to say and have no clever ideas. But I'm sure you appreciate it, Phil.
Oh yeah, I worked hard to get here.
Yeah.
It's really hot out today. Cycling home from work was difficult.
Oh, started from the bottom of the tallest hill in London. Let's see. What are we here to talk about on today's episode of Heavy Hands? I'm getting distracted already.
Thrilling light heavyweight clash between with title contentions. With title implications on the line, Connor.
No, stop reminding me. Okay, I'll be honest.
Shogun Rua.
I'll be honest here. I'm sick. There's something wrong with me. So I still enjoy seeing Shogun Rua fight when it happens. Like, I went back researching for this card. I watched his fight with Volante. I can still appreciate what Shogun does. I still root for him. I still like him. He's done some tremendously impressive things in his career. And that excitement is only slightly muted by like realizations such as this one. Rua's last hurrah fight with Alexander Gustafsson was almost 5 years ago, and he's still doing it. He's still here. So, yeah, for those who don't know what we're talking about, and if you don't, and you are listening to this show, you are probably in the wrong place. But next week is a UFC event in Hamburg, Germany, and the main event is a fight between Mauricio Shogun Rua, Shogun, versus Anthony Lionheart Smith, who is stepping in to replace... Who was it originally? Wasn't it? It was someone else originally. It was Volkan Oezdemir.
Was it? Oh, it was Oezdemir.
Yeah. So it was like Oezdemir who would have probably killed Shogun dead, and it would have made sense. And instead, it's going to be Anthony Smith who kills Shogun dead, and it's going to be way more depressing and disheartening. But on today's episode, this is a slow fucking intro. I'm dragging ass. On today's episode, we are going to talk about the main event of UFC Hamburg, and we're also going to talk about the main card opener, a lightweight bout between Nasrat Haqparast, who you may remember from a very impressive close defeat to Marcin Held in his, I believe also a short notice UFC debut. He's taking on fellow uber athletic prospect Mark Jacasey. So that one should be interesting. After that, we are going to get into the events of UFC Boise, which of course was main evented by Junior Dos Santos and Blagoy Ivanov, a fight we did not discuss either on our main episode last week or on the bonus episode preview we did, because it wasn't really interesting. But it was a decent card overall, and had some relevant and important results, some very exciting moments, and some really bizarre shit that we have never seen the likes of before. So we're going to get into our recap of that after UFC Hamburg. Let's go ahead and dive in on this scintillating main event. First of all, Phil, where do you stand emotionally in regards to Shogun Rua at this point in his career?
I basically just see him as the living embodiment of how incredibly crappy light heavyweight has become.
Yeah.
That he is not a bad fighter.
No.
But he has dropped several visible athletic tiers from his prime, and he is currently on the longest winning streak of his UFC career.
That is extremely depressing. Is that true?
Yeah, he's never had a 3-fight win streak in the UFC.
Oh my god. Well, I guess at least those streaks were being broken by the likes of Lyoto Machida, and not I don't know, OSP. So, yeah. I mean, it's kind of useful to have Shogun around though, as a measuring stick. At some point, probably when he's 45, we will have a useful metric for determining just how shitty the division actually is. Like, at this point, it's a mystery how bad light heavyweight could possibly get. We don't really know.
Where is the basement?
Exactly. So we need to see Shogun just continually slough off athletic talents until he finally can no longer beat a top 10 light heavyweight. And it hasn't happened yet. He's fighting Anthony Smith here. And Phil, I mean, I look at this matchup, I just think it's going to be one of those fights where Shogun is still, I think, in many ways, the better and craftier fighter, and certainly in many ways the more consistent fighter, which sounds very strange. But that youth, as it so often is, may be the main determining factor in who actually wins this one.
I really want to pick Shogun.
Oh, I really want to pick Shogun.
I think I might have to pick Shogun.
Why? Let's talk about their games. What's Shogun got going on at this point? He's no longer the super athletic, dynamic kicker he was. So what's his game look like now?
He's smart.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to give it to him. This is one of the things that we've seen throughout his UFC career. I think, we've discussed before, and I think that depressed us, that I do think that that Shogun's deterioration over time due to his injury history has been a little overstated. And I think that it has often just been due to the fact that he is somewhat lackadaisical with his training and can't stay anywhere and tends to isolate himself from from the people who work best with him, like Rafael Cordero. But within the context, whilst I feel like outside of the cage, he is perhaps a bit too fond of high air and not training. Inside it, he is incredibly smart. And we've seen a lot of diverse, clever game plans from him in the past, often involving, things like his underrated wrestling game, bringing back his leg kicks for the rematch with Little Nog, or, just the kind of switching up his pressure approach a bit for Lyoto Machida in the rematch. He is a clever fighter, and we saw that because that was the real difference against when he fought
Gian Vellante.
Gian Vellante.
How dare you imply that Gian
Vellante is not exactly hard.
Yeah.
But the thing about Shogun is that when he finds something that works, he just does it again and again, and he will just hammer home a weakness until, whether it's the leg kicks against Machida or the overhand right counter against Vellante, and he'll just keep going back to the well. He unless you give him some reason not to, or the takedowns against Dan Henderson. And Anthony Smith has no defense.
Yeah, he's no Gian Vellante,
Smith
but
is incredibly insecure.
Yeah. do you say that because
I'm going to ask you a question, Connor?
Okay.
What is Anthony Smith good at?
Phil, I may have asked myself the same question a dozen times watching his footage. Yeah, it's difficult to say. I think Anthony Smith is a prime example of what is both good and bad about light heavyweight. He has a tremendous frame for this sport and for his division. He's 6'4", very long arms, very long legs. Seems to have good power. He seems quite durable. There was a spate early in his career where he was getting knocked out over and over and over, but I think that's more because of the insecurity. We've seen enough of his fights where he has completely fallen off after having a strong start or whatever. And it's somewhat encouraging that recently he has started to come back, which is, that is something he never did as far as I've seen earlier in his career. It was almost always the other way around. He would just completely blow his wad trying to get the finish early or putting a ton of pressure on and then gas and get beaten up and often submitted. So that's something. But the way he comes back and what he spends most of the fight doing up to the point that he has been coming back is not particularly inspiring. I'll say this. I think he can be better than he usually is. Because it's just I don't know, maybe because he's insecure. I don't know what it is. He seems to have this really narrow vision sometimes, where like I'm thinking about his fight with Hector Lombard, for example, which I think is a fairly good parallel to this. Like we're looking at a shorter but decent counterpuncher with power, and like Anthony Smith spends the latter half of the first round literally just standing in front of Hector Lombard, being hit by almost everything he throws. Shots to the head, shots to the body, huge savage leg kicks, just standing there and just letting him hit him, and occasionally trying to respond with a far too slow hook counter or right hand. It's a lot of 3-2s from Anthony Smith. And he goes back to his corner, and his coach is like, all right, listen, you need angles, okay? You cannot stand in front of him. You need to make space. You need to play with your lead hand, all right? You need to bring his eyes up, and you need to add some layers. Like, he was giving him extremely prescient tactical advice. And Anthony Smith did those things very hard for about 30 seconds when round 2 began. He came out,
then went back to getting hit by everything.
Yes. He came out, he moved a ton, like far too much, which is probably why he had to stop doing it. Tons of angles, just a burst of erratic energy trying to throw Lombard off. But it was working. You know, when he was flashing his hands, he put 3 punches together very quickly into the round, and then he just stopped and went back to doing what he was doing. And then I guess he hyped himself up when Lombard got tired and knocked him out. So it doesn't inspire a ton of confidence in him. But my fear is that it won't matter because this is light heavyweight. And it may truly just come down to these guys are going to fight for 15 to 25 minutes. What if Anthony Smith can take the shots and Rua can't? Or what if Shogun gets tired because he's beating Anthony Smith up? Or, I mean, there are a lot of ways this can go wrong because, I mean, I want to talk more about Shogun's game. I'm glad you mentioned his intelligence as a fighter because I think it is a really underrated aspect, elemental aspect of his game. But in many ways, he is craftier than he's ever been, but also in many ways, he is a far worse fighter than he's ever been. He's more fragile than he's ever been at any point in his career. He is much slower, especially in terms of foot speed. He's much more of a plotter now than he ever was before. And so it's really like craft, and you know, still from Shogun, a fairly crude degree of craft against youth, which is a very fascinating matchup, always is, but I don't know. It just bums me out to think that might be enough for Anthony Smith. Because, yeah, what is he good at? Like, what's his game? What does he do well?
Yeah, he's just violent, but
yeah,
he's violent without having any durability to back it up. Well, I mean, he doesn't have, like you said, he's not, I don't think he has much durability. Like, Lombard hurt him badly several times.
Yeah.
In both the first 2 rounds, I believe.
I mean, I think his durability,
he gets knocked down. He has good recovery, but
yeah,
there's just something, like you said, there's just something hugely panicky about his game. I mean, it's not subtle. I mean, we've seen there are many fighters that weaponize insecurity in effective ways. Mm-hmm. You know, GSP and Nick Diaz probably being the classic examples, but they've done it in extremely controlled ways where mm-hmm. they've formulated it into really structured games. With Anthony Smith, it's just, you can see it just going wild, and sometimes he's riding it and sometimes it's just eating him. I mean, that second and third round against Lombard, where he's just looking at Lombard like wide-eyed, mm-hmm. like fighting with himself, going, what is he saying to him? He's going,
"Do you know my name now, Hector?" That's what he was shouting when he returned to his corner.
Yeah, he says, "Do you know my name now?" And then afterwards he's like, "You should respect me. You should respect me." and it's just...
What if Anthony Smith just started crying in a fight? Would it make him more powerful than we ever imagined?
I mean,
I think it might.
In some ways, but it would probably make him even more, like, he's just totally uncontrollable as to whether whether he's going to just detonate or fight back.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure his coach was struggling with that reality in many of his last few fights. Like he does tend to get some pretty good advice, and that's where I think a lot of like the adjustments that lead to the comebacks have come from. But it must be really difficult to get Anthony Smith to like fight to a game plan.
There are two things. He's horrendously hittable.
Yeah.
He has some of the very worst defense that you will see outside of Stefan Struve. And Shogun, one thing that I would say Shogun actually has maintained is that he has fairly decent cardio for who he is now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and he's smart, so he's good at maintaining it as well. He is good at pacing himself.
Yeah. So like back in some ways, the Shogun we have now has better cardio than the one who lost to Forrest Griffin did.
Mm-hmm.
He's consistently done reasonably well in the third rounds, with the exception of, I think, the Corey Anderson fight, if I recall correctly, which I don't recall that fight very well at all. I'm going to be honest. But
it's light heavyweight. No one blames you.
Yeah. But, Jean Vellante, he basically wore him down. Antonio against Lil Nog kept a decent pace for the whole fight. His cardio is actually reasonably solid. Mm-hmm. And given how anyone with a name that Anthony Smith has beaten lately has just been horrifically washed, and often, in the case of Hector Lombard, has visibly tired themselves out simply with their own offense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, it's going to look stupid if Shogun just gets OSB'd.
Yes.
But I just kind of picture him just running up to Anthony Smith and just doing right hands a lot and not getting tired. And that's kind of it. And Anthony Smith won't react to that in any significant way.
Doing the right hand might in fact be a very useful tactic for him in this matchup. Yeah, I mean, I want to give a little love to like what Shogun still does well. Like it's not just affection for his old career that keeps me invested in him and his insistence on continuing to fight. Like his game has changed and adapted to his failing body and lacking discipline and everything. And it is worth pointing out, like on the discipline note, I don't think anything's changed. So this will be, I think, 4 fights in a row that he has been back with Rafael Cordero, at least 4. It has, I think, made a change in terms of how focused he seems in his fights. I think his conditioning looks better than it did, like back in the Forrest Griffin days. It's kind of back up to snuff. So Cordero has always been a very good fit for Shogun, I think, and experienced Cordero, I think, is an even better fit for super experienced Shogun. But he's officially a, capital letters here, crafty veteran at this point in his career, and a surprisingly good counterpuncher. I want to talk about the masterful James Toney-esque shoulder roll to counter right that Shogun used to set up the finish on John Vellante. Like he's not a dumb fighter. His game is really well put together, and he adapts. Like the way that he got his counterpunching to work in that fight. He hit the body exceptionally well, which he has since the first Dan Henderson fight. Like he's an underrated body puncher. He used his jab. He did a lot of feinting. Like really effectively. He was playing with timing a lot, where he would kind of body feint his way into range, and then a half beat after Vellante expected it, then he would go with the shot to the body. Changing targets, throwing combinations, and actually, this astounded me because I forgot he had done this, using his head movement to avoid punches, which, the little like silly swaying back and forth Mike Tyson impression has been a hilarious staple of Shogun's game for many years. I don't recall a fight before the Vellante one where he was like using his feet and his upper body at the same time to get under, aside, and out of the range of punches, as well as he did against Vellante. Now that's an extremely predictable fighter in Vellante, but how much more depth is there really to Anthony Smith's game than there is to Vellante's?
In some ways, there is less depth to Anthony Smith's game than there is to Vellante's.
Sure.
Like, he does more things, and he will change as the fight goes on. But in a vacuum, Jean Vellante's jab, right hand and leg kick are all like mechanically, functionally better techniques than most stuff that Anthony Smith does.
Yeah, that's fair.
So I'm still going to pick Shogun, and I recognize that this will make me look like a moron if he just goes out there and Anthony Smith just dusts him like he did Richard.
Oh, I'm riding with you straight to hell, buddy. I'm picking Shogun. I think Anthony Smith is like I in my heart I believe Anthony Smith is going to flatten him like at any moment. And it makes absolutely no sense to pick Shogun at this point in his career, but there is a reason that Shogun is currently on the longest winning streak of his UFC career, and it is because light heavyweight is even worse than it was when he joined the UFC, and Shogun is, in a surprising number of ways, better than he was then.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I would expect him... I mean, is Anthony Smith better than Corey Anderson?
No.
So, I mean, I would just expect, like, I don't feel like... I feel like it's really a Shogun deterioration pick if you pick that one, and that's fine, but we haven't actually seen material deterioration between his last few fights.
No, it doesn't feel like
not to the extent that I can pick him over a style matchup this bad.
Yeah. I'm kind of with you. I think he's got a lot of openings in this fight. I think Smith is going to spend a lot of time doing nothing, and I think Shogun is going to get him to do just the things he wants to do to, land a lot of right hands on his chin. So, I don't know. He's going to get killed. I don't know.
Yep.
God damn it.
Zane will mock you and me for even thinking about it.
Yeah, he will. He will. But, Shogun, ride or die forever. Let's end this first segment, Phil. When we come back, we have one other fight from UFC Hamburg to discuss. That's, as I said before, Nasrat Haqparast versus Mark Diakiese. Pretty interesting matchup, I think, between two very athletically gifted and one of them a still promising up-and-coming sort of fighter. Diakiese I'm a little less sure about, but who knows? There's time. And after that, we're going to get into the events of UFC Boise. As I said, the main event... Sage Northcutt did some stuff, and Nico Price propped Randy Brown's head on his foot and then smashed his head like a fucking melon. So we're going to talk about all of that and more after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now, let's get back to it.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. High energy now. All right, hello, and welcome back to Heavy Hands. As I said, we're talking about Nasrat Haqparast in a matchup against Mark Diakiese. Phil, you requested this one, so I'm going to let you kick things off. Why? Why should we talk about Nasrat Haqparast and Mark Diakiese, who is on a two-fight losing streak? This is indeed a fight between two men who lost at least one of their last two fights.
Because there is more talent in the cage than you're likely to see any other... Well, you're certainly more talent in that cage than there's going to be at any other point in this card.
What do you mean? Marcin Tybura versus...
And like in terms of raw ability, like a lot of other cards as well. These are two seriously gifted guys. One of them, I think we've seen in a kind of raw physicality kind of way. Mm-hmm. And the other one in kind of both a raw physicality way, but also what looks like the beginnings of a just capital A, capital G, actually good way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that, to sort of spill the beans, I think Diakiese, you're implying, is the physical force fighter that we see as just a physical force more than anything else. And Hawkprost is the like promising. He looks. I mean, his game looks like a, I don't know, Kelvin Gastelum-esque. He looks. I would say the defining difference for me, like this might be kind of vague, but the defining difference is that Jacasey, they both have great athletic ability, they both have great physical talents, but Hawkprost seems to have feel for fighting that Jacasey lacks. Jacasey has a lot of forcing and a lot of like hunting for certain things. I would say that Hawkprost seems to have a much better just feel for how distance and timing, like how a free-flowing fight works. He seems to be able to swim in those kind of circumstances.
So he is a, I think, a natural technician. He is just someone who you teach him good technique and you teach him, and he immediately picks up on why and how that slots into a game. He looks very much like someone who, if he is well coached, and he is tremendously well coached, will go far.
It's, who's the coach? It's John.
He is a combination of Rafael Cordero and Firas Zahabi.
Oh shit!
Yeah,
I like that. Yeah, he definitely.
I mean, if you want to get a combination of technical violence and kind of clinical games and clinical gamesmanship that you'd want for a prospect to learn, you don't get much better than that combination.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about his game. Like, what does Hawkprost do well? Like, you can see at times he does tend to do what Jacasey does a lot of. Like, he does fall back on, I think, his understanding that he has innately more speed and power than a lot of other fighters. Like especially when he's put under pressure, when he's throwing combos, he does tend to wing his shots a little bit. And he's a very dynamic fighter. Like, a lot of like leaping and driving himself into his shots still, where you can see moments of really nice tight technique. Like there was a counter left that he popped Marcin Held with as he was retreating. That was just a straight, effortless punch that did the job and shook Held up. But then other times we see him sort of like, and in that fight especially, exhausting himself, going for big winging shots as well, which I think that should be kind of the main concern against a guy like Marc Jacasey, is getting into a Marc Jacasey kind of fight where, yes, it'll probably be close to 50-50 in a lot of ways, but that's the kind of fight that Jacasey wants and usually has, and it doesn't seem like Hawkprost has to fight that kind of fight.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'd say about Hawkprost is that he is a nuts and bolts fighter. And that's not a bad thing to be, because as you said, he fights like an athlete, but the approach that he generally goes for is a fairly sound one that makes sense. I mean, it's the classic southpaw thing of just, use a lot of movement, wait for them to come into the open stance and close the distance just land the counter left hand. It's not but he has a very functional sprawl. He can handle himself very well on the ground. Everything you can see, like, this is a good basic approach to build a game plan off. And I think the fact that he lost a close decision to Marcin Held is great for his career, at least partially because I'm not really sure that he actually lost that decision.
Yeah, it was a very competitive fight all the way through. I mean, it was essentially like two fights happening back and forth, where it was Held holding Hawkprost down largely on the ground, and Hawkprost largely getting the better, or at least landing the biggest shots on the feet.
Yeah, and it's just that, for me, this is Marcin Held is a dreadful style matchup for an inexperienced fighter, because this is exactly the kind of thing. Well, I mean, there's a reason why we call it the prospect submission loss, is that young fighters don't traditionally know how to stay safe on the ground. They panic their way out, or they get hugely overconfident and just try and explode, or they get trapped somewhere between the two. So to be able, for someone like to have a fight against Marcin Held where he gets stuck on the floor repeatedly, where he gets put into multiple submissions, and not only like debatably win that fight, but also be stuck in that position in the third round and then get back out of it and come back. To me, that says tremendously good things.
Yeah, it was really good to see him like towing the line of the prospect submission loss, but refusing to step over it. Like after he knocked Held down, I think he went on top of him and Held immediately started rolling for a leg lock, and Haqparast, like being inexperienced, he was right over Held looking to finish and let his feet come together and got taken down and his momentum killed by the leg attack. But he didn't get submitted. Like, it was just a prospect loss. He felt himself nearing danger enough to at least back off. And it sort of suggests that in time, he's going to be able to figure out how to intelligently navigate those dangerous spots so that he can continue to force the finish. What does Jacasey do well? He's still billed and discussed by commentators as a striker, which still kind of baffles me because his main thing is to just be really strong and hold on to people and fling them around. And the defining characteristic of his fights is like clinching and enforcing his physicality on his opponent. I mean, he fucking choke slammed Drakkar Klose in his one of his most recent fights. He's just a very physical wrestler kind of fighter, and it relies a lot more on his ability, his physical abilities than he does on clean technique. And that the concern, I think, is that one problem that Haqparast could not get over against Held, and this got worse as he got tired, was that sort of dynamic leaping stuff I was talking about, where he just kept throwing himself into Held. And that could be a lot more. I mean, Held's a much better grappler and wrestler, technically, but that could be a problem. Jacasey, I have seen him maintain a pretty ridiculous pace in some pretty brutal fights, where he can just kind of ride things out as long as he has his hands on his opponent. And I think it's going to be really difficult for Haqparast. He'll probably land a good clean shot, but if he's going to go in to finish or follow up, if he's leaping into Jacasey's chest and making contact with him after every single strike, he's no Shogun Rua, technically, Phil, if you know what I'm saying. He's not staying on the end of his punches, and that can be a problem.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think you're right about that. And Jacasey does have a couple of tricks that it's taken very experienced or very tough guys like Hooker and Klose to kind of get around. And I think specifically with regards to Haqparast, the big worry for me is that Jacasey does that thing where he kind of zips forward and kind of feints the double or triple left hand and then comes with the big right.
The Tyron Woodley Classic.
Yep, the Tyron Woodley Classic. We saw it in Evans' Rampage as well. And if you're used to zipping backwards out of range and being, a southpaw who's just not there to be hit unless they're dictating, and you're used to pulling the trigger on people who come in, that's a tough setup for you.
Yeah,
that's something you want to get away from. So yeah, I mean, this in some ways I feel like this matchup is a little unfortunate because Haqparast should have gotten someone. Both of these guys could have gotten someone a lot easier.
Yeah. Based
on their last fights.
No, the UFC doesn't do that, Phil. They just smash their toys together. They're like, oh, these guys are both strong and promising. Oh, and they both come off losses. Just fucking smash them together like action figures.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that Jacasey as well, you can see these little moments that he's good at figuring out where people are going to be and putting his hand there. Or putting his foot there. He's just so unstructured in how he does it.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, like in the Dan Hooker fight, before the end, Jacasey suddenly started lighting him up. He suddenly thought you'd suddenly see him going, wow, instead of just blitzing this guy from the outside, what if I just stood at my effective range and just picked him off at different points and just kicked his legs, went high, just mixed up my approach rather than just trying to blast in on him. And then he went back to his grappling roots and got submitted.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pick for me is Haqparast. I do think he is a much more promising fighter in a lot of ways. The thing is, like, Jacasey it's going to be a kind of fight where there's a lot of openings for Jacasey to just athlete his way to a sudden and surprising victory, or possibly to a grinding victory if Haqparast can't solve some of the issues he had against Held. There's also the possibility that, like, Jacasey just needs a slight change to his training or his mentality, or he needs to show...
He's also training with very good people. Like, I know that he's at ATT. He is apparently sparring a lot with Dustin Poirier,
right.
And that is a good person for learning how to kind of have a kind of technically grittily mix it up in the lightweight division.
Mm-hmm. So, like, yeah, Jacasey could be very close to turning the corner as well, because, like, he does look like one of the best athletic talents in this division, just in a raw physical level. So,
yeah, this is for me. This is very easily the most interesting fight on this card.
All right, you sticking with Haqparast as your pick as well?
Yep, reckon so. I mean, I'm watching tape on the two. I'm a little less sure about it than I was, but yeah, I think I just trust him to fight a smarter fight, and I also think that he's one of those guys who will accept a smart fight if he's got one trained into him. If his team has seen weaknesses in Jacasey, he looks like the kind of guy who will exploit them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there were enough good signs for a young fighter in that Held fight and in some of his other fights as well. But yeah, I'm excited about this. I think this will be a pretty fun clash. And on that note, why don't we talk about some heavyweights?
Yay!
On to UFC Boise. Last weekend, Junior Dos Santos shocked the world by coming back to outpoint Blagoy Ivanov, winning every single round in a... I mean, I will say this. We watched Ngannou Lewis not very long ago. This was worlds better than Ngannou Lewis. I saw people comparing it, and I'm like, no, this is basically like JDS Rothwell, but slightly less exciting. Like fewer.
It was fine.
Yeah, it was all right.
Yeah, it was just JDS Rothwell without the Sparta kick.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
It was slightly more competitive.
Yeah, and in very worrying ways. I mean, I guess that's... What can you talk about when you talk about Junior Dos Santos, other than, like, the Anthony Pettis question? That it's, at this point, like, there is absolutely no hope that Junior Dos Santos sorts out his fundamental issues.
What are you talking about? He's back.
Yeah, he's back. He's
Just
not...
like Pettis is back.
He's not Shogun. Again, I don't want to say that again, but, like, seriously, Shogun has done a tremendously more effective job of adapting his game than Junior Dos Santos, who has literally never changed. He has never changed technically as a fighter. He has added moves. He is the embodiment of the MMA as a video game mentality that still permeates this sport. Because, like, I said this last week, maybe on this show, maybe on the Vivisection, but this is to me is like, these are the defining thoughts I have about Junior Dos Santos. He fought Cain Velasquez the second time. He got obliterated. And then he came back and said, don't worry, guys, it's not going to be the same as the last fight. I've got some tricks up my sleeve. And what were those tricks, Phil? They were...
elbows.
Yes, up elbows in the clinch, and turning his back to get off the fence. Those are essentially his new innovations. And it was mostly like, how can I shy away from a clinch, but also maybe land an elbow? It was a very small technical addition to his game, very limited in scope, that did not come close to addressing the problem. It was sort of like all the women who talked about how hard they'd worked on their armbar defense before fighting Ronda Rousey, or on their armbar escapes. Like, no, that is not where the problem begins. You have to nip it in the bud. And then against Stipe Miocic, I mean, this is the really damning one, because this is after the lessons he refused to learn against Velasquez. He responded to the pressure the way he did in this fight by backing himself into the fence. And his one adaptation was low kicks. Just like the elbows against Velasquez, he's like, okay, well, this is what's going to change things now. I'm going to do exactly what I always do, except plus low kicks. And the really troubling thing, as Zane pointed out, is not that that was his only innovation. Like, maybe at that point still a coach could be like, okay, let's do this, let's add these things. It was that Junior Dos Santos thought he was fighting perfectly up to the point that Stipe knocked him out.
I mean, the most damning one is still the Overeem fight, where he got knocked out, and then afterwards he was just like, didn't you see what I was doing? I throw a wheel kick. If that had worked, he would have been knocked out.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of damning moments.
Christ, JDS
is the point in his recent career. But was Blago Ivanov ever going to beat him, barring a sudden knockout?
That is what I was thinking as I was watching this fight. Like, as I was watching them walk to the cage,
sure, I
was just thinking that Junior is sort of washed, but not really. And I was just thinking how shocked I would be if Ivanov actually won, because JDS does not have the functional footwork to be able to either fight someone who is a really determined outfighter or a really determined pressure fighter. Mm-hmm. And Ivanov is neither of these things, being a man who in fact backs himself into the cage, a short, not particularly powerful, but hyper tough counterpuncher that JDS was just going to be able to jab and eventually set the right hand up against almost at will, with his sole advantage being that he was a southpaw and JDS is slightly more uncomfortable against southpaws than he is against orthodox fighters.
Took Junior about a full round and a half before, or maybe even a full 2 rounds before he was comfortable expecting the right hook. Like that southpaw right hook really threw him off at first. But Ivanov gave Junior Dos Santos his kind of fight. And for all of these like limited, never changing, stuck in their ways fighters, like you give Anthony Pettis or Alexander Gustafsson or whoever their kind of fight, there's a reason that they're top fighters. Like if you give Dos Santos space and a relatively slow pace, all the things he does well completely overwhelm all the problems with his game. He's got a great jab. He uses feints off of that established jab almost better than anyone else in this division. He does a great job of working the body with his jab, and he adapts. Like he did adjust to the counters that Ivanov was throwing. He did throw off his timing and start to feint his way in, draw the counter, and then respond to it. He does a really good job of just using like fundamental boxing offense to mix up his attacks. So as long as he's got his range, he's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I would argue that it's better than anyone else in the division. I mean, if there was some kind of enforced mid-range thing, like where people just stood on 2 podiums like it was American Gladiators, and I think JDS would be utterly undefeated in this.
Yeah.
Like, you're just on these things for the entirety of the fight, and maybe you knock the other guy off, and that's MMA now. Mm-hmm. Like, he'd be, admittedly, he'd still probably lose to an actual boxer, but just for those traits, yeah. But yeah, other than that, he's never going to beat the people he can't beat.
No.
And he's always going to beat up on style matchups like this until he just physically disintegrates.
Yep, which, it's heavyweight, so that sounds about appropriate for this division.
I mean, this thing is that like there are people out there who are partway between the style matchups, because it asks these guys an interesting, like, it's an IQ test for them. That's basically what JDS is at this point. He's a tough IQ test. Miocic failed it on his first time around, and then the second time around, he was like, all right, yeah, don't bother trying to take this guy down unless you have literally limitless cardio. Mm-hmm. And like Kane did, it's just a waste of time because he has incredible cardio and very good takedown defense, and I'm just exhausting myself here.
Yeah.
I'm just going to punch him in the face.
Punch him in the face. Yeah. It's surprisingly easy to do.
So the question, there's interesting questions about, how would a guy like, Volkov or Blades, or for example, approach the JDS style conundrum. But that's all he is now. He's a measuring stick.
Yeah, which it's fine, I guess. In terms of resume, like God, heavyweight sucks, man. Like he might be one of the
resumes full time.
Yeah, he is one of the top heavyweights of all time, and his game has so many holes. But there are not a ton of heavyweights. Honestly, there are very few who can actually fight the kind of fight that gives Dos Santos real problems. Like, everyone's going to give him some of those problems because it doesn't take much to get him leaping backwards into the cage. Like, there are some things in this fight, like the way he's like constantly glancing around. It's like, this is the troubling thing. He's like aware of what his problems are, but he hasn't done anything to change the way he fights. So like he seems hyper cautious of backing into the fence. I draw that from like him glancing around constantly, looking behind himself, looking at his feet, looking from side to side. He's trying to suss out, but that's a bad sign. Like, you don't seem to know where you are in the cage, that you have to constantly keep checking. Where is your like feel? Like, what's your training environment? Do you not train in a cage, or how are you not used to the octagon at this point? But also, like, that's the problem isn't that you just don't know where the fence is when you back up. The problem is that even Blago Ivanov, if he decides to put 3 punches together and just sprint forward, you will run 30 feet backwards in a straight line until your back hits the fence. That's the problem. So yeah. It's heavyweight, so it is what it is. But some of the other stuff from this card was actually pretty meaningful and pretty impressive. And of course, the one fight that we did choose to focus most of our attention on last week's bonus episode preview of this card was, for some reason, stuck on the prelims, a featherweight matchup between Alexander Volkanovski and should-be top 5 Darren Elkins, although no longer. Volkanovski took that would-be ranking away from him. So we're going to get into that fight. That's sort of our co-main event, I suppose, of our recap, before getting into the other events of this card, of which there were many of interest. So one more break, and we will be back with all of that after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. We're talking about Volkanovski. Alexander, the Great Volkanovski, took on Darren Elkins in a fight that, beforehand, I thought could go wrong for him in many ways at many points. Much as I just said about Haqparast against Jacasey, one of my main concerns was whether or not Volkanovski could win without wrestling, because it seemed like he might have to. Because the problem is like, if your pressure striking comes packaged with pressure wrestling, can the two work without one another? If not, you end up wrestling with Darren Elkins, and that's a problem. And as it turned out, it wasn't that big of a problem. Volkanovski is a very good wrestler and a very intelligent fighter. I think that was like one of the main things that made me pick him last week. Was I found it hard to believe that he couldn't put the same kind of hurting on Darren Elkins that Mirsad Bektic did, without making the same like bafflingly predictable decisions that Bektic did and exhausting himself as a result. And that kind of came through. He made some mistakes early and changed the way he was fighting, like stopped going for guillotines for one. And also, as he did against Mizuto Hirota, realized after hurting Darren Elkins badly in the first round, I think quickly realized he probably wasn't going to finish him, and decided to slow the pace and just sort of stretch out his chances and fight a relatively safe, while still very exciting fight, because he dominated Darren Elkins, Phil. I mean, he really did. Elkins had a lot of the opportunities that he usually turns into comebacks, and he just didn't get to use them. Volkanovski really beat him up from bell to bell.
Yeah, it was impressively one-sided.
It was.
Physicality and wrestling. It's fine to say these are two things that you can use to beat up Darren Elkins.
Yeah,
but it is notable how few people have actually done that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've talked about Dennis Bermudez a little bit, but he is a tremendously active, tremendously physical person, and he had every physical ability, every physical tool necessary to beat Darren Elkins, who is has no physical gifts apart from being tough and strong, and having a lot of cardio, but is otherwise incredibly slow and uncoordinated. And similarly, Mirsad Bektic was Volkanovski before Volkanovski was Volkanovski. He was the guy who came out of nowhere, physical phenom, pressure wrestler, ground and pound monster, all these kind of things that Volkanovski was. A very similar fighter in a lot of ways. And he just couldn't keep up with Darren Elkins.
Mm-hmm.
And Volkanovski could.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was a physical thing. I really don't. No. Like, people are going to say, oh, well, like, what you just said, Darren Elkins, he can't compete with that. But I think it was like the key difference between what Volkanovski did and what Bektic did is how Volkanovski managed himself and the fight.
It was a control. He was controlled.
Yes.
He did not blow energy on anything.
Yeah, despite allowing himself, it ended up looking like a very good decision to keep the wrestling aspect of his game. He didn't really change anything about the way he fights. I think it feels like he went in there thinking like, I am going to do what I always do better than I've ever done it. I'm just going to put on the best performance of my career and fight my game and believe that if I do it right, Darren Elkins can't suck me into his fight. And he was right. Like, he went out there, he mixed the wrestling and the strikes, he kept the pressure on, but he managed himself. He was controlled. And you could tell he didn't want to be, right? Like, there were a couple moments. I mean, I don't blame him. He knocked Elkins down twice in the first round. He was hurting him over and over with the big right hand. And you could tell there were moments where he just wanted to pour it on and actively forced himself to chill. And that's what is really, really impressive from a relatively inexperienced, relatively young fighter, is that he was able to rein himself in, knowing what Darren Elkins can do, what he's capable of.
Yeah. And, want to give shout out to Darren Elkins, because he really got screwed in this. And I also want to shout out, Volkanovski himself for saying that. He said, Elkins shouldn't be fighting someone like me. And he was right. He shouldn't have been top 10.
True.
He shouldn't be getting outranked by Mirsad Bektic that he knocked out 2 fights ago, and Bektic's win since then is over someone that Darren Elkins also beat.
Yeah, this was on our bonus set, but last week we were pretty mystified at the fact that Elkins was ranked. What was he ranked? Like 11 or something?
10, I think.
Yeah, right at the bottom. And ahead of him are guys like Cub Swanson, who is not on a winning streak, and Mirsad Bektic, most shockingly, because of a win over Godofredo Pepe after losing to Darren Elkins. Elkins probably should have been like right up there next to like Jeremy Stevens in this division before this fight.
So, one of the questions I had with this fight was that, did you think that Elkins threw less takedowns than he normally does? Do you think he went for less? Do you think he went for less shots?
Maybe. Maybe. I mean, I think he kind of felt that it was difficult though.
Yeah, that's the thing, because I felt that he was, and maybe this felt like a slightly similar dynamic to the Bermudez fight. I think Elkins went for takedowns early, and then there were a couple of things which happened. One of which was that I believe Volkanovski got him in a pretty deep submission. Mm-hmm. I think, Volkanovski also just chucked him on the floor on one of his takedowns.
Yeah,
and then managed to get back from underneath him. I think he quickly recognized that he might actually be, despite the fact that Elkins was visibly the larger man, mm-hmm. he was probably at a strength disadvantage. Yeah,
no, I think you're right. I think that the strength and the power, I think too, like, I I don't know. I think Volkanovski's willingness to keep out wrestling him was a problem for Elkins.
Yeah.
Like Volkanovski's willingness to dive into the clinch in such a way that positions that he chose were ones that Elkins couldn't really take advantage of. Especially like the thing. One of the things I really liked. I already mentioned this, but Volkanovski went for a guillotine after hurting Elkins in the first round, and then he went for another near the end of the round after dropping Elkins a second time, and got taken down as a result, and ended the round on his back, or at least spent a few seconds with Elkins on top of him. And I think he may have toyed with a guillotine in the second, but bailed on it the moment that Elkins started to improve position. And even from the beginning, but especially as the fight went on, Volkanovski was moving into a single leg position and controlling Elkins against the fence, or digging for an underhook and doing some striking, and always in a relatively dominant position, and always disengaging as the fight went on, always disengaging before Elkins had any opportunity to do anything about it. So I think there did seem to be a strength advantage, but I think a lot of it too was just good decision making from Volkanovski, that he would go for his takedowns, he would recognize he wasn't going to get him, and he wouldn't just sit there and uselessly clinch with Elkins. He would do a little attritional damage and then disengage, and then the onus suddenly was on Elkins to cross that gap. And Volkanovski did a very good job of maintaining his distance. Like he spent a lot of the striking portion of this fight right on the end of his range. Did a pretty good job using his jab, landed a lot of big overhand rights, and by the end of the fight was putting the left hook on there too. So like, I don't know, it just struck me as a very intelligent performance from Volkanovski. Despite the fact that he did what he always does, he did it in exactly the right way. Yeah,
you know what it reminded me of a little bit? GSP Fitch.
Yeah, I can see
just
that.
In terms of the kind of both the physical and the mental matchup, because a lot of what makes Elkins work is it's not just volume or pressure, but it's also variety. Mm-hmm. He throws a lot, and he does a lot of different things. He has, he is a kind of low single, trip and clinch takedown guy, but he will also throw shots whenever he can because he's not really scared of what's coming back at him. No strike he throws is pretty. I think I said on Twitter is that like he has a striking style which is basically Dan Henderson's leg kicks, but every strike he throws is like Dan Henderson's leg kicks.
Yeah. His right hand is a Dan Henderson leg kick in terms of aesthetic beauty.
But he will throw a ton of different things. Mm-hmm.
His left kick, baby.
He throws combinations into body kicks. He'll kick the legs. He's a really good interstitial fighter. He gets in the clinch and he'll throw elbows. He's really good at kicking off the clinch. Mm-hmm. I think
he makes reads too.
Against Bektic, and so a lot of the time he is a variety fighter.
Yeah,
and that allows him to kind of strike with wrestlers and wrestle with strikers. Mm-hmm. And to keep them sort of guessing as to what he was going to do. And Volkanovski did not concede a single space to him, including the I'm going to go for submissions that don't work space, which Elkins normally dominates.
Sure.
That's his that's his thing. He goes for guillotines and they don't work.
Yeah.
But Volkanovski was just like, no, I'm not giving it to you. I'm going to go for guillotines. Mine.
Because I'm watching this right now, the fight footage is rolling in the background as we discuss it. I just watched Darren Elkins slam his own head into the floor. At the end.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of your tweet from when the fight was going on. Do you recall what you said?
I said that he was building up his limit break by deliberately damaging himself, I think.
He was trying to up the charge bar, and Volkanovski wasn't hurting him enough, so he had to start damaging himself. And Elkins, he makes reads too. Like, he was doing some smart stuff in this fight. For example, his right uppercut was there whenever Volkanovski was coming into the pocket. Volkanovski liked to stay tight and relatively in close. The uppercut is a perfect defensive punch for that kind of fighter. And Elkins was landing it, but it's almost like it's weird because it doesn't feel like strategizing, but it was like the perfect thing for Volkanovski to just do his normal shit. It was like GSP against Fitch, where it's like, I'm just going to fight the perfect version of my fight. I don't care what you do. I'm going to just not give you openings and beat you up. I don't know. It was a great performance.
Yeah.
And Volkanovski
hit harder shot for shot. Anytime you get into clinch range where you do your best work, I am going to discourage you from it. I'm going to throw hard, and you're going to feel it, and then you're not going to know when I'm going to back out again. Which means you're not going to just do this kind of stuff where you pour 3 or 4 shots and then shoot and then try and grab a seatbelt and then kick me in the head. Like, none of that's going to happen.
Yeah,
incredible performance.
A tremendous performance, absolutely. It was, again, Elkins should have been top 5. Volkanovski is officially 100% the real deal. No longer a prospect, but in my mind, a contender in the making, and probably in the very near future, I think we'll see him being lined up for a title shot. So, very exciting stuff, and, Darren Elkins he'll be okay. I mean, in 30 years he won't, but he'll be back.
He sounds incredibly slurred when he talks, and I've pointed this out, and people have said, he sounded like that for years, which does not really reasure me in the way that it might.
Good news. He's been punch drunk for a decade now.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, these are the things that we try to avoid thinking about when we look at tough motherfuckers like Darren Elkins. Well, I guess that's about it for us. I mean, there was some other stuff on this card. Like, again, I don't think anyone...
It was a solid card. Like I think I said when we were discussing, it was a card that was almost indistinguishably good, in that almost every fight had people in a kind of similar position in their careers, and almost everyone had something to recommend it.
Yeah, which is why I think the Volkanovski-Elkins fight was the obvious main event for us. Because it was the one that it separates itself from from the rest of the pack. And, good times. And the good times will continue if you are tuning into UFC Hamburg next weekend. So make sure you check that one out. Many, many names that I am very confident in my ability to pronounce, which is always a great sign. So that one's coming up. When we come back next week, we will get you with the results of that. What's after that? We don't have another week off for a while.
Alvarez Poirier 2.
Ooh, you started to say Dustin Poirot and combined it with Eddie Alvarez's name.
Yep.
I love when you say Dustin Poirier. It's my favorite.
I know.
Yeah.
And that fight and that card is going to be amazing.
Alvarez, Poirier, Aldo, Stevens, Jędrzejczyk, Torres. I mean, hot damn. And our old friend Jordan Meehan. Plus, like, cool little gems like John McDessie, Ross Pearson. I want to see that. Yeah, so we got some good stuff coming up in the future. You just got to make it through UFC Hamburg, but hopefully, for all of our sakes, that card will feature yet another impressive late career Shogun win. So we'll see. But until then, let's see. What do you have coming out this week, Phil? Anything people should know about?
Nothing too exciting. Just the preview we've got for the depression of Hua Smith. I don't think we're going to be doing the exciting co-main of Teixeira Anderson, but so check that one out.
Yeah, I'm still working on shit that I mentioned last week, so don't have any expectations for me, dear listener. But that's pretty much it for us. Check us out on Patreon. Find us on social media. You want to find Phil, you can find him at Evil Greg Jackson on Twitter.com, and you can find myself at Boxing Bush, that's BUSCH. Again, check out the Patreon. We had a bonus preview last week. Who knows, this episode's looking kind of long, so some of these fights may in fact be on that, on a bonus episode this week as well, if it can't cut down to about an hour. And until next week, thank you all for listening. If you came here for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.